November 15th, 1967. The pre-dawn darkness clung to Firebase Charlie like a shroud, broken only by the amber glow of cigarettes and the faint luminescence of instrument dials in the communications bunker. Hill 8081. South rose from the jungle floor near the demilitarized zone, its red clay slopes scarred by monsoon rains and artillery craters from previous engagements. The air hung thick with moisture and the metallic scent of ammunition, while mosquitoes droned incessantly around the perimeter wire. 22-year-old Lance Corporal David Whiskey Wilson adjusted the frequency dial on his PRC-25 radio, the static crackling through his headset like distant lightning. Steam rose from the muddy trenches as the first hints of sunrise painted the eastern horizon pale orange. Wilson had been in country for 11 months, long enough to understand that silence in the jungle was never peaceful. It was the sound of death, holding its breath. The firebase housed Bravo Company, 3rd Battalion, 9th Marines, positioned to monitor North Vietnamese infiltration routes through the DMZ. 37 Marines occupied defensive positions scattered across the hilltop's perimeter, connected by communication trenches and protected by interlocking fields of fire. Wilson served as the primary radio operator, his world reduced to frequencies, call signs, and the electromagnetic threads that linked isolated Marines to artillery batteries, air support, and medevac helicopters orbiting beyond the jungle canopy. The PRC-25 weighed 23 pounds, its olive drab housing containing vacuum tubes and transistors that transformed human voices into radio waves capable of reaching aircraft thousands of feet overhead. But technology, Wilson had learned through bitter experience, was only as reliable as the men who operated it under fire. His voice had become the lifeline for Marines who trusted their survival to electromagnetic signals bouncing off the ionosphere at the speed of light. The strategic situation around Firebase Charlie reflected the broader stalemate that characterized American operations in South Vietnam during late 1967. Operation Niagara, the massive B-52 bombing campaign supporting the defense of Khe Sanh, had begun drawing North Vietnamese forces towards set-piece battles where American firepower advantages could be brought to bear. Fire support bases like Charlie served multiple functions: early warning posts for enemy movement, staging areas for rapid reaction forces, and symbols of American commitment to defending South Vietnamese territory. The coordination required between Marine ground forces and Air Force, Navy, and Army aviation assets demanded precise communication protocols that Wilson had mastered through months of training and combat operations conducted under increasingly dangerous conditions. Command structure at Firebase. Charlie followed standard Marine Corps doctrine emphasizing small unit leadership and decentralized decision-making. Captain Michael Rodriguez commanded Bravo Company from a reinforced command bunker near the helicopter landing zone, while First Lieutenant Thomas Barrett led 2nd Platoon positioned along the firebase's most vulnerable northern approach. Staff Sergeant James Murphy supervised the communications section, ensuring radio protocols maintained coordination between ground forces and supporting arms. The firebase's elevation provided clear fields of fire across valley approaches, but those same advantages made it a prominent target for North Vietnamese forces moving supplies and reinforcements toward the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Intelligence reports indicated increased enemy activity throughout the region, with reconnaissance flights detecting movement along known infiltration routes that converged near Firebase Charlie's position. Wilson had grown up in rural Michigan, the son of a World War II veteran who rarely discussed his experiences in the Pacific Theater. The Marine Corps had offered structure and purpose after high school graduation, but nothing in his background had prepared him for the moral complexity of Vietnam. Technical training at Camp Pendleton covered radio procedures, frequency management, and communication security protocols, but the reality of coordinating life and death decisions through crackling static and atmospheric interference required intuition and courage that no manual could teach. Each morning, Wilson performed preventive maintenance on his radio equipment, checking battery levels, antenna connections, and backup systems that might determine whether wounded Marines received medical evacuation or died slowly in the jungle heat. The tactical situation around Firebase Charlie had deteriorated steadily during the previous week, as North Vietnamese forces demonstrated sophisticated understanding of American operational patterns. Enemy mortar teams had registered precise coordinates for key positions within the firebase, while reconnaissance elements observed defensive routines from concealed positions in the surrounding jungle. The North Vietnamese tactical doctrine emphasized patience, stealth, and the ability to mass forces quickly for coordinated attacks before melting back into terrain that provided natural camouflage and multiple escape routes. Psychological warfare played an important role in enemy operations, with deliberate efforts to isolate American units and create the impression of abandonment by higher headquarters. At 05:47 hours, the first 122-meter rocket impacted the firebase command bunker with devastating accuracy, instantly killing Captain Rodriguez and destroying the primary communication equipment. The explosion lifted Wilson from his sleeping position and slammed him against the bunker wall, filling his mouth with dirt and concrete dust. Secondary explosions followed in rapid succession, walking across the hilltop in a pattern that suggested detailed reconnaissance and careful target selection. The enemy had chosen their moment precisely, dawn, when visibility was limited but sufficient for accurate indirect fire, and when American air support would be transitioning between night and day operations with potential gaps in coverage. Wilson's first coherent thought was to protect the radio equipment, throwing his body over the PRC-25 as debris rained down from the reinforced ceiling. When the immediate barrage lifted, he discovered that the primary antenna had been severed by shrapnel, reducing transmission range to less than 3 kilometers. The backup generator had sustained damage, forcing reliance on battery power with operational life measured in hours rather than days. Through the smoke and confusion, Wilson could hear Marines shouting for corpsmen, reporting casualties, and calling for ammunition resupply. The command structure had been decapitated in the opening seconds of the attack, leaving junior NCOs to coordinate defensive responses without clear guidance from higher headquarters. The tactical situation deteriorated rapidly as North Vietnamese forces demonstrated coordination and firepower that exceeded intelligence estimates. Mortar fire continued to impact key positions with precision that suggested real-time observation and fire direction from concealed spotters. The enemy had employed classic infantry tactics, using indirect fire to suppress defensive positions, while assault teams maneuvered through dead ground, invisible from the firebase perimeter. Wilson realized that conventional communication procedures would be inadequate for the coordinated response required to break the enemy assault. The Marines were effectively surrounded, cut off from routine supply lines, and facing an enemy force that had planned this attack for weeks or months. First Lieutenant Barrett's voice crackled through the radio net from 2nd Platoon's position, reporting direct assault by at least company-strength forces approaching from multiple directions simultaneously. The lieutenant's transmission was interrupted by the distinctive chatter of AK-47 automatic rifles and the sharp crack of RPG explosions, painting an audio picture of desperate close-quarters combat. Wilson could hear the stress in Barrett's voice as he requested immediate artillery support and close air support, but the radio operator understood that standard request procedures would take precious time that the surrounded Marines did not possess. Every minute of delay would cost lives, while decisive action offered the only chance for survival. Staff Sergeant Murphy crawled into the communications bunker, his left arm hanging useless from shrapnel wounds sustained during the initial barrage. Blood seeped through his utility uniform as he attempted to establish contact with the Artillery Fire Direction Center at Camp Carroll, but atmospheric interference and equipment damage made communication impossible beyond short-range tactical frequencies. Murphy looked at Wilson with eyes that reflected both desperation and determination, understanding that the young radio operator represented the last link between 37 Marines and the outside world. The staff sergeant's final words before losing consciousness would haunt Wilson for decades. "Get them out of here, son. Don't let them die for nothing." Wilson made a decision that violated every standard operating procedure he had learned during 13 months of training in combat operations. Rather than requesting permission through proper channels or waiting for authorization from surviving officers, he switched to the emergency frequency reserved for close air support and began transmitting coordinates for immediate strike missions against enemy positions. His voice remained steady despite the chaos surrounding him, methodically providing targeting information that would bring devastating firepower within meters of friendly positions. The radio operator had assumed responsibility for decisions normally reserved for commissioned officers, understanding that hesitation would guarantee defeat, while bold action offered hope for survival. The deception required perfect execution of communication protocols that Wilson had memorized through months of repetitive training designed to create automatic responses under stress. He adopted voice patterns and terminology used by field-grade officers, modulating his tone to convey authority and confidence while providing grid coordinates with mathematical precision derived from map studies conducted during quieter moments. The radio operator understood that his transmissions would be recorded and analyzed after the battle, potentially resulting in court-martial proceedings if his unauthorized actions were discovered. But 37 lives hung in the balance, and Wilson had learned that leadership sometimes required accepting personal risk to protect others from harm. The lead pilot of a flight of F-4 Phantom jets circling at 15,000 feet hesitated before acknowledging Wilson's transmission, sensing something unusual about the radio procedures, but lacking sufficient information to question what appeared to be legitimate orders from ground forces under attack. Military culture emphasized immediate response to requests for close air support from troops in contact with enemy forces, and Wilson had crafted his deception to exploit that institutional bias toward action. The F-4 Phantoms carried external loads of Mark 82 500-pound bombs and 20mm cannon ammunition capable of devastating effect against infantry formations caught in the open. But delivery accuracy depended entirely on precise target coordinates provided by ground observers. Wilson's first airstrike mission targeted enemy mortar positions identified through careful observation of muzzle flashes and the sound signatures of different weapon systems. He guided the aircraft through a bombing run that required split-second timing between aircraft approach, bomb release, and ground force preparation for blast effects that would impact friendly positions as well as enemy targets. The psychological impact of close air support extended beyond its physical destructiveness. The sound of American jets overhead reminded Marines that they had not been abandoned, that their sacrifice mattered to a larger cause, and that massive firepower stood ready to defend them against overwhelming odds. The first bombs impacted with earth-shaking force that Wilson felt through the soles of his boots, creating fireballs that consumed jungle vegetation and enemy personnel within 50-meter radius kill zones. Secondary explosions indicated direct hits on ammunition storage areas or weapons positions, while the abrupt cessation of incoming mortar fire confirmed successful target neutralization. Wilson continued coordinating additional airstrikes while simultaneously monitoring tactical radio nets for damage assessments and medical evacuation requests from platoon positions scattered around the firebase perimeter. Each successful bombing run bought precious time for defensive reorganization, but Wilson understood that air support alone would not be sufficient to break a determined enemy assault. The North Vietnamese forces adapted quickly to American air support, dispersing into smaller groups and timing their movements to exploit gaps between bombing runs. Enemy commanders demonstrated tactical sophistication that matched their strategic planning, using terrain features and weather conditions to minimize exposure to aircraft while maintaining pressure on Marine defensive positions. Wilson realized that conventional air support tactics would not provide decisive advantage against an enemy that had prepared extensively for American response patterns. Something more desperate, more innovative would be required to achieve the tactical surprise necessary for survival. As morning progressed toward midday, ammunition supplies dwindled among the Marine defenders, while casualty reports mounted from all platoon positions. Medical supplies were running critically low, with several Marines requiring immediate surgical intervention to survive wounds sustained during the prolonged engagement. The enemy had achieved tactical surprise and maintained operational tempo that prevented Marines from establishing effective defensive coordination. Wilson faced a terrible calculation that would define the rest of his life: risk everything on a single coordinated strike that violated every safety protocol, or watch fellow Marines die slowly while maintaining the illusion of security through conventional procedures. Wilson conceived a plan that would either save Firebase Charlie or destroy it completely along with everyone defending it. He would request a massive bombing strike directly on the firebase itself, gambling that Marines in reinforced bunkers could survive blast effects that would obliterate enemy forces caught in open terrain. The technique was known as danger close air support, with ordnance delivered within 300 meters of friendly positions, close enough that fragmentation and blast overpressure would threaten defenders as well as attackers. No pilot would approve such a mission without explicit authorization from senior field commanders, But Wilson possessed technical knowledge and communication skills necessary to make his request appear legitimate. The deception required flawless execution of radio procedures that Wilson had practiced countless times during training exercises and previous combat operations. He assumed the identity of a fictitious forward air controller, using call signs and authentication codes that would satisfy pilot verification requirements while authorizing the most dangerous close air support mission of the Vietnam War. Wilson understood that his deception would be discovered eventually, but the immediate survival of 37 Marines took priority over long-term consequences for his military career or legal status under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. The lead pilot acknowledged Wilson's transmission with obvious reluctance, recognizing the extreme danger inherent in bombing friendly positions, but lacking authority to refuse what appeared to be properly authenticated orders from ground forces in contact. The F-4 Phantom carried a full external load of Mark 82 general-purpose bombs, each weapon containing 192 pounds of composition H6 explosive, capable of creating lethal fragmentation patterns, extending several hundred meters from the point of impact. Delivery accuracy would be critical. Bombs landing too far from enemy positions would provide no tactical benefit, while weapons impacting too close to Marine bunkers would cause massive friendly casualties. Wilson provided final targeting coordinates with mathematical precision derived from intimate knowledge of Firebase Charlie's defensive layout accumulated during months of occupation. He had memorized distances between key terrain features, calculated blast effects for different weapon types, and identified the optimal impact points that would maximize enemy casualties while minimizing friendly losses. The radio operator's voice remained calm and professional as he authorized destruction that would transform the hilltop into a lunar landscape of overlapping craters, understanding that his decision represented the last desperate gamble for survival by Marines who had exhausted all conventional options. At 12:47 hours, Wilson transmitted final authorization for the bombing strike, committing himself and 36 other Marines to a course of action that would either vindicate his tactical judgment or confirm his reckless disregard for human life. The words came slowly, deliberately, each syllable carrying the weight of life and death decisions made by a 22-year-old Marine who had never attended officer training school or commanded troops in combat operations. But leadership, Wilson had discovered, was not about rank insignia or formal authority. It was about accepting responsibility when others could not or would not act to protect lives that hung in the balance. The bombing run began with a sound like distant thunder rolling across the mountains, building in intensity until individual explosions merged into continuous roar that seemed to shake the Earth's foundation. Wilson huddled in the communications bunker as 500-pound bombs detonated in sequence across the firebase perimeter, each explosion creating a fireball that consumed everything within its blast radius. The psychological terror of being bombed by friendly aircraft was almost unbearable. Marines trained to take cover from enemy fire found themselves helpless against their own air support, trusting their lives to calculations made by a radio operator they barely knew personally. The bunker walls flexed and cracked under repeated shockwaves as bombs impacted progressively closer to Wilson's position, filling the air with pulverized concrete and red clay dust that made breathing difficult. Equipment rattled loose from mounting brackets while the radio antenna whipped back and forth like a flag in a hurricane. Wilson pressed himself against the earth and tried to count explosions, calculating whether sufficient ordnance remained to complete the pattern he had requested. Each detonation brought the possibility of immediate death from friendly fire, but also the hope that enemy forces were suffering even greater destruction in their exposed positions. The final bomb in the sequence landed approximately 40 meters from the communications bunker, close enough that Wilson felt the heat wave wash over him like opening a blast furnace door. The explosion lifted him from the ground and slammed him against concrete walls with force sufficient to crack ribs and dislocate his left shoulder. Dirt and debris filled the bunker for several minutes after the last detonation, creating an eerie silence broken only by the settling of disturbed earth and the distant sound of aircraft departing the target area. Wilson waited for what seemed like hours before venturing outside to assess the results of his desperate gamble with death. What Wilson found when he emerged from the bunker confirmed both the success and the terrible cost of his decision to call friendly fire on his own position. The enemy assault had been completely shattered, with North Vietnamese bodies scattered across the hilltop in positions where they had been caught by surprise during the bombing attack. Crater fields extended across the firebase perimeter, transforming familiar terrain into an alien landscape of overlapping holes and scattered equipment. But Firebase Charlie had been effectively destroyed as a military installation, with most defensive positions collapsed and critical infrastructure reduced to rubble and twisted metal. 19 Marines emerged from their bunkers alive, though many bore serious wounds from shrapnel and blast effects that would require immediate medical attention. 18 had been killed during the initial enemy assault, or by the friendly bombing that Wilson had authorized, their bodies scattered across the hilltop in positions where they had fought and died defending their fellow Marines. Wilson looked at the faces of the survivors and saw a mixture of gratitude and accusation. He had saved them from certain death, but at a price that would haunt everyone who lived through that afternoon on Hill 881 South. Staff Sergeant Murphy regained consciousness as medical evacuation helicopters approached the landing zone, his first words a weak inquiry about casualty figures and the tactical situation. Wilson provided a brief situation report while helping to load wounded Marines onto stretchers, but the full magnitude of what had occurred would not become clear until after-action reports were compiled and investigated by higher headquarters. The radio operator had demonstrated initiative and courage under extreme pressure, but he had also violated fundamental principles of military discipline and endangered friendly forces through deception that could have resulted in even greater casualties. The evacuation of Firebase Charlie began within 2 hours of the bombing strike, as UH-1 Huey helicopters braved continuing sniper fire to extract wounded Marines and recover bodies of the dead. Wilson coordinated medical evacuation procedures from his damaged radio equipment, providing landing zone information and threat assessments to pilots who risked their lives flying into contested airspace. Each helicopter that landed successfully represented a small victory against an enemy that had demonstrated sophisticated tactics and unwavering determination to inflict maximum casualties on American forces. Wilson remained on the hilltop until the final helicopter departed, ensuring that no Marine was left behind and that sensitive communication equipment was either evacuated or destroyed to prevent enemy intelligence exploitation. The radio operator's last transmission from Firebase Charlie was a routine administrative message confirming completion of evacuation operations, but his voice carried undertones of exhaustion and trauma that would characterize his communication style for months afterward. The battle had lasted less than 8 hours, but its psychological impact would influence Wilson's entire subsequent military career and civilian life. The investigation into Wilson's actions began before the helicopters reached the medical facilities at Da Nang, as senior officers attempted to understand how a junior enlisted Marine had assumed command authority during a critical combat engagement that resulted in both tactical success and significant friendly casualties. Radio transcripts were analyzed for evidence of unauthorized communication procedures, while surviving Marines provided testimony about Wilson's decision-making process during the battle. The military justice system required accountability for actions that violated established protocols, regardless of their tactical effectiveness or moral motivation. Wilson provided detailed testimony about his decision to deceive air support controllers and authorize bombing strikes on friendly positions, accepting full responsibility for both the lives saved and the casualties caused by his actions. He made no attempt to justify his deception through appeals to military necessity or claims of superior tactical judgment, understanding that leadership required acceptance of consequences as well as credit for successful outcomes. The young radio operator had acted within moral framework that defined Marine Corps values, placing mission accomplishment and troop welfare above personal safety and career advancement, but had employed methods that challenged fundamental assumptions about military discipline and command authority. The official investigation concluded that Wilson had demonstrated exceptional initiative and courage under extreme pressure, saving the lives of Marines who would certainly have died without his unauthorized intervention. But the report also noted that his deception of air support procedures had violated established safety protocols and could have resulted in catastrophic friendly casualties if circumstances had been different or if his tactical calculations had been incorrect. The Marine Corps faced a familiar dilemma in evaluating actions that achieved necessary objectives through unauthorized means, especially when those actions were motivated by loyalty to fellow Marines rather than personal ambition or glory. Wilson received the Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism during the defense of Firebase Charlie, though the citation carefully avoided mentioning specific details of his radio deception or the controversial nature of his tactical decisions. The ceremony took place at Marine Corps Base Quantico 6 months after his return from Vietnam, attended by family members who understood little about what their son had experienced during 13 months of combat operations in Southeast Asia. The medal represented official recognition of courage and leadership under fire, but Wilson valued more highly the letters he received from Marines whose lives had been saved by his willingness to risk everything on a single desperate gamble. The psychological aftermath of combat proved more challenging than the physical wounds Wilson had sustained during the battle at Firebase Charlie. Survivor guilt, common among combat veterans, was compounded by his knowledge that his own tactical decisions had contributed directly to the deaths of fellow Marines who had trusted their survival to his judgment and communication skills. The radio operator struggled with questions that admitted no clear answers, whether alternative courses of action might have saved more lives, whether his deception had been morally justified under extreme circumstances, whether the tactical success at Firebase Charlie had contributed meaningfully to broader strategic objectives in Vietnam. These moral doubts persisted long after Wilson's physical wounds healed, and his active military service ended with an honorable discharge in 1969. The broader context of American involvement in Vietnam provided little comfort for Marines who had served with distinction in combat operations that ultimately failed to achieve their stated political objectives. The fall of Saigon in 1975 raised painful questions about the meaning of sacrifice made by Americans who had fought and died believing their service would preserve South Vietnamese independence and demonstrate American resolve against communist expansion in Southeast Asia. Wilson returned to Michigan after completing his military service, carrying memories and experiences that set him apart from civilians who had not shared the intensity of combat operations or the moral complexity of leadership decisions made under extreme pressure. The transition from military to civilian life proved difficult for many Vietnam veterans, complicated by a society that remained deeply ambivalent about the war, and sometimes openly hostile toward those who had served in it. Wilson found employment in telecommunications, applying technical skills learned as a Marine radio operator to civilian work that seemed mundane compared to the life and death decisions he had made coordinating air support at Firebase Charlie. The decades following his military service allowed Wilson to reflect on the broader meaning of his experience and its relationship to American military traditions and moral values. He came to understand that his actions had embodied principles that transcended the specific context of the Vietnam War. Loyalty to fellow servicemen, acceptance of responsibility under pressure, willingness to risk personal safety for the welfare of others, and commitment to mission accomplishment despite overwhelming obstacles. These values had sustained American military forces through conflicts spanning more than 2 centuries, from the Revolutionary War through contemporary operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. Wilson's story illustrates the individual human dimension of military service that often disappears in strategic analyses and political debates about warfare and foreign policy. Behind every tactical decision, every technological innovation, and every policy directive stand individual servicemen and servicewomen who must translate abstract concepts into concrete actions that determine whether people live or die in combat situations. The radio operator's experience at Firebase Charlie demonstrates that military effectiveness ultimately depends not on sophisticated equipment or elegant doctrine, but on the character and judgment of individual human beings operating under conditions of extreme stress and moral ambiguity. The Firebase Charlie engagement also reflects broader themes about innovation and adaptation under pressure that characterize successful military operations throughout American history. Wilson's willingness to improvise when standard procedures proved inadequate exemplifies the kind of tactical creativity that has enabled American forces to succeed in diverse operational environments, from Pacific Island battles during World War II to urban combat in Iraq and Afghanistan. Military organizations must balance the stability provided by standardized procedures with the flexibility required to address unforeseen circumstances that cannot be anticipated during peacetime training and preparation. The moral complexity of Wilson's actions highlights ethical dilemmas that confront military personnel in combat situations where competing values, obedience to lawful authority versus personal initiative, protection of friendly forces versus adherence to safety regulations, individual survival versus mission accomplishment, loyalty to immediate comrades versus broader institutional goals, create conflicts that admit no clear resolution through application of standard ethical frameworks. Military ethics training attempts to prepare servicemen and servicewomen for such dilemmas, but the ultimate test comes in combat when theoretical principles must be applied under conditions of extreme stress, incomplete information, and time pressure that prevents careful deliberation. The technical lessons learned from Firebase Charlie influenced radio communication procedures and close air support protocols for decades after the Vietnam War ended. Wilson's improvisation under extreme pressure demonstrated both the capabilities and limitations of battlefield communication systems that connected small units to supporting arms and higher headquarters. Military communications technology evolved rapidly during the 1970s and 1980s, incorporating digital systems and satellite links that reduced dependence on line-of-sight radio transmissions vulnerable to atmospheric interference and enemy jamming. But the human element remained constant. The requirement for individual initiative and moral courage when technology failed and lives hung in the balance. Today, more than 5 decades after the battle at Firebase Charlie, the hilltop where Wilson made his desperate transmission remains largely unchanged by human activity. The jungle has reclaimed defensive positions, filling bomb craters with vegetation and erasing most visible traces of the American military presence. Local villagers occasionally discover fragments of military equipment buried in the red clay soil, silent testimony to events that transformed the lives of 19 Marine survivors and the families of 18 Marines who died defending Hill 881 South. The physical evidence of the battle has largely disappeared, but the human impact continues to resonate through subsequent generations who inherit both the pride and the trauma of military service. Wilson passed away in 2018. His obituary noting his service as a Marine radio operator in Vietnam and recipient of the Navy Cross, but providing few details about the specific actions that had earned him the nation's second-highest decoration for combat valor. His family donated his military papers and personal effects to the Marine Corps Historical Center, ensuring that future historians would have access to first-hand accounts of combat operations that shaped American military doctrine and influenced the development of communication technologies still used by armed forces around the world. The radio operator's legacy extends beyond his individual actions to encompass broader lessons about leadership, innovation, and moral courage under extreme pressure. The story of Firebase Charlie serves as a reminder that military history consists not merely of grand strategies, technological developments, and political decisions made in Washington, but of individual human beings who must make split-second decisions that affect other people's lives in ways that resonate for decades afterward. Wilson's transmission on November 15, 1967, lasted only a few minutes, but its consequences continued to influence military communication procedures, tactical doctrine, and ethics training for generations of servicemen and servicewomen who followed. The radio operator's courage under fire exemplifies values that transcend the specific historical context of the Vietnam War: loyalty, initiative, moral courage, and willingness to accept responsibility when others cannot or will not act to protect lives that hang in the balance. In the end, the jungle outlasted everyone who fought there, reclaiming the hilltops and valleys where young Americans learned hard lessons about war, leadership, sacrifice, and the price of survival in an environment that showed no mercy to the unprepared or unlucky. But the voices that spoke through military radios on distant fire bases continue to echo in the training programs and institutional traditions of armed forces that inherited both their technical innovations and their moral legacy. The courage demonstrated by individual Marines, soldiers, sailors, and airmen in moments of extreme crisis represents the foundation upon which American military effectiveness has always depended, regardless of changes in technology, doctrine, or strategic circumstances. History is not made of victories or defeats, but of individual acts of courage that affirm human dignity, even in the midst of humanity's greatest moral failures. Wilson's voice, crackling through static on a damaged radio, calling fire on his own position to save the lives of fellow Marines, represents something essential about the American military experience that transcends political debates about specific conflicts or foreign policy decisions. It speaks to the fundamental willingness of ordinary citizens to accept extraordinary responsibility when circumstances demand heroic action, even when that action violates conventional wisdom or established procedures. The transmission that saved 19 Marines and changed military communication procedures forever lasted only seconds, but its moral resonance continues to inspire military personnel who face similar decisions in contemporary conflicts around the world. Wilson's legacy reminds us that technology, doctrine, and strategy are only as effective as the human beings who implement them under pressure, and that the ultimate test of military effectiveness lies not in equipment specifications or organizational charts, but in the character of individual servicemen and servicewomen who must translate institutional values into personal action when lives hang in the balance. History is not made of victories. It's made of voices that refuse to disappear. What should we cover next? Subscribe and share your thoughts on this video. Your feedback and support are immensely valuable and help me keep improving the content.